Welcome, everybody. My name is Benjamin Day.
And I am Jillian Mason.
And this is Medicare for All, the podcast for everybody who needs health care.
It certainly is. And let me tell you guys something about this episode that we're about to do here. So, all right, we gotta go back here. So, 2013 to some of us seems like yesterday. But let me set the scene for you, right? So it's 2013. You just got off the high of surviving 2012, which was the year that the Mayans said the world was supposed to end.
I'm glad
the biggest song of the year was Thrift Shop by Macklemore. And everyone was doing the Harlem Shake on Vine. Our younger viewers, by the way, you should just keep a tab open on your phone while listening to this episode because it's going to be chock full of outdated references that you're going to need to Google. But anyway, the most important thing by far that happened in 2013, at least for us here on this podcast, is that Benjamin Day became our executive director at Healthcare Now, the national single payer organization. And so today we are going to be talking about the last 10 years in the Medicare for All movement. We're going to deal with the highs, the lows, and the weird in between shit with our very special guest. That was my drum roll. Benjamin Day.
I've always wanted to be a guest on this show. I'm so glad I've finally arrived, I feel like.
Yeah. I feel like we're like celebrating your expertise. And also it means that I have to talk less, which is thrilling for me.
Oh, no.
All right. So we actually at Healthcare Now, we actually just celebrated your 10-year anniversary. And of course, we celebrated by roasting you and making fun of your monotone personality and your general niceness.
I don't know what you were talking about.
I know that was other people. I know better. But even before you were hired at Healthcare Now, you were actually the director of MassCare, which was the Massachusetts Medicare for All group, right? Back in 2006 when we first met each other.
We won't talk about the pop culture references from 2006. It would be too depressing and too outdated.
What was happening in 2006?
I don't even remember.
Oh my God. It was a time. So we get personal on the podcast frequently. Sometimes we like actually read our medical bills out loud. But I don't think you've actually talked about your origin story recently. So can you maybe tell the folks a little bit about how you came to be the Medicare for All zealot you are today?
That is my job title, actually. Zealot. Yeah, executive zealot. Well, as you know well, maybe probably many other people don't know, but my background was actually in labor education and labor research. So I was still kind of in the grassroots organizing world, organized labor, more like it. But then I came down with a pretty significant health issue. It was a panic disorder, where even though at the time I had no idea that's what it was. I was actually misdiagnosed for quite a few months, but I kept having I would just start shaking uncontrollably, and I couldn't stop the shaking. It would sometimes last for hours. Sometimes the attacks would start in the middle of the night while I was sleeping. I had no idea what was happening. I thought I had some terrible physical illness, but it got bad enough that I couldn't go to work anymore. I couldn't go to school. I was in a grad program at that time at the School of Industrial and Labor Relations. So I ended up being admitted to the hospital. I ended up landed in the emergency room 2 or 3 times in a row. And eventually they admitted me to the hospital to just kind of stabilize me, get me on some drugs that would stop the attacks. And it ended up being, in the long term, it ended up being probably one of the best health interventions that ever happened to me, having this total crisis. Because I had had bad depression all my life, and only this really serious thing led me to kind of take that seriously, get therapy, like get some help. And so it was really the best thing that ever happened in my life, but not according to my insurance company, because when I was being discharged from the hospital, the doctor sat me down and said, I don't want you to panic, but your insurance company said they're not going to cover your stay in the hospital. And I didn't panic until I actually got the hospital bill, which was, it was $4,000, $5,000. At that time, I was earning less than $15,000 a year. So
Sure.
I was like, this is going to bankrupt me. You start thinking about like, could I possibly raise that much money from like friends and family? I wasn't sure. And I had been trying to recover from like a challenging kind of mental health illness. And suddenly I was way more worried about just like financial ruin, bankruptcy, losing my credit for the rest of my life, way, way worse things to me in any case. And that's when, I won't go through the whole rabbit hole of like my appeals fight with them. It was actually really, it was really tough because like I was in such rough shape at that time. I was really not in a good position to be like, I'm going to fight
advocating for yourself.
Health insurance company. Yeah. So other people really kind of took the fight on for me, which I'm really grateful for in retrospect. But after that kind of nightmare experience with the healthcare industry, I had thought I was like, I had one of these stupid like middle class moments where I was like, I've got a job, I've got good at health insurance. Like I thought I was safe, but it turns, I don't know. One of my big lessons was like, no one has healthcare security in America. Even if you have a good job, good health insurance, unless you're like a true many multi-millionaire, you're just one serious illness or injury away from not being able to work, losing your job, losing your insurance, and then suddenly you're facing all these costs on your own. But yeah, shortly after that, I moved back to my hometown of Boston, and I was looking for a job, and I ran into Masscare, which was the Medicare for All group in Massachusetts. They were looking for someone with organizing skills, and I just kind of changed what I was doing with my life. I was like, I want to fight for this, make sure that something what happened to me could never happen to anyone else again. And obviously since then, many people have far, far worse stories than I do. Mine was like just your run of the mill nightmare story, even though it felt like the end of the world to me at the time. But yeah.
Well, I'm very grateful that happened to you. Because
thanks so much.
Because you're here, and it motivated you to take on a leadership role in our movement, and B, because I really can't imagine dealing with you with more anxiety and depression.
Right. Yes. No, very helpful.
So that's been a really good movement, a really good thing for everyone in your life. Regardless, let's go back to that time, right after you were hired at Masscare, right? You were hired like a few months after the Romney Care legislation was passed in Massachusetts. By the way, Romney did not want this legislation to pass, and so we called it Romney Care as like a joke, right? Like to like tar his name with this healthcare reform. Anyway, so Romney Care passed back in 2006. You got hired at Masscare. So we do now know that you're very old, but if the dementia hasn't set in yet, if you can remember, what were things like? What was the state of the Medicare for All movement at that time? And what lessons are there from that kind of like state level reform that you witnessed firsthand?
Yeah, I really enjoy when we make fun of each other's age because we're basically like the same age.
Yes,
taking each other down with the ship here. But
I watch more TikTok, so I know younger slang. That's the main difference.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh my God. And our intern did all this amazing research on like the years that these things happened. Not just the Mayan calendar, but 2006 was when Hannah Montana debuted on the Disney Channel. This is the person who is Miley Cyrus today. That's how long back this was, but I can remember all this very vividly, unfortunately, because it's easy to remember traumas. I mean, at that time in 2006, we didn't even really use the term Medicare for All. I think the bill in Congress was called the Improved Medicare for All bill, but no one recognized the phrase Medicare for All. It wasn't in use at the time. We more used the term single payer healthcare. And even then, very few people. I mean, it was so outside of kind of mainstream consciousness that I remember I had like a single payer healthcare sticker or something that I'd wear around in the subway if I was on the buses. And people would be like, oh, yeah, single parent healthcare. I'm all for that. I support that. Or they would say single prayer healthcare. I mean, people literally heard everything except what it meant, which was so confusing if you didn't already know what it was referring to.
Actually, single prayer is kind of the system that we have now.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe collective prayer.
You might need more than one, but pray for recovery. So, but that was, I mean, obviously that just sets the stage of how much things have changed between then and now. But yeah, Romney Care, it passed through a Democratic legislature in Massachusetts with a Republican governor. And it really, to me, it kind of set the model for what like corporate Democrats or centrist Democrats, how they approach healthcare reform and have for like the last 2 decades, which is let's bring all of the stakeholders to the table. One of my least favorite phrases. and that means like, let's bring the hospitals and the health insurance companies and the pharmaceutical companies, and then like one fake patient advocate organization to the table. And that's what they mean by stakeholders. I mean, let's be real. The only real stakeholders in the healthcare system are patients, right? And maybe healthcare workers, but we're the only ones who are living and dying and, suffering. The corporations these industries are not, they don't have any real things at stake except their own money. So that was the model. And then you kind of try and hash out a compromise to expand access to care that all of these industries can agree to. And spoiler alert, that means you can't do any cost control, because that means they'd be losing money. So all you can do is really agree to spend more money and try to cover more people. And that, to me, in a thumbnail, is like the Romney Care model that eventually became the model for the Affordable Care Act. And so, the law did have kind of a dampening effect on Medicare for All organizing for a couple of years. It was very difficult to criticize that Romney Care model. The outcomes of that law were not totally straightforward, though. There was a huge increase in insurance coverage, which was like their main goal, was to get that number down. So it looks good. And they cut the number of uninsured in Massachusetts about in half. But when you look at like studies that looked at your actual improved access to care, it had a very small improvement on improving access to care. And the other thing that happened, which happened first in Massachusetts, and then again after the Affordable Care Act, the whole country got a taste of it, is that insurance companies and employers responded to this law by massively increasing deductibles, co-payments, what we call cost sharing. That's just like what you have to pay when you go to the doctor that's not covered by your insurance. And then they kind of invented like the modern version of limited networks, where all these hospitals and physicians, you can't even see them. That was like balloon tested in Massachusetts.
And then I remember we talked in a couple episodes back. We had talked about how that was really like they sort of made immigrants in Massachusetts, right?
Exactly.
The test case for those limited networks.
Let's try out on vulnerable immigrants whether we can put them in such a limited network that they almost can't access care.
Fucking fantastic.
So that spread throughout the whole state. So that's why we didn't see as much of like an improvement in access to care, but the insurance numbers looked really good. That's because more people got insurance, but then everyone got like shittier insurance. Was kind of the result. And I mean, that wasn't written into the law, but it was the industry's response to the law. So
it wasn't written out of the law. I mean, I think that's
exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
There were ways that they could have written the law so that didn't happen, but
you could have passed Medicare for All, for example.
Yes. Something like that.
Yeah. But basically, I mean, since then, Democrats do not want to take on the healthcare industry, was my big takeaway from there. They want to expand access to care. And I don't know, to me, it's such hypocrisy when you claim to have like as a value universal healthcare, but then you're not willing to do any of the things that you would have to do to have a universal healthcare plan, which is to take on healthcare industry and corporations. So.
All right. So so the Affordable Care Act, right? Then, which is based on Romney Care, right? The Affordable Care Act is actually passed in 2010, but most of the major provisions actually didn't go into effect until 2014. So do you feel like the ACA played out similarly to Romney Care in Massachusetts, or was there a big difference there?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we're out of the 2006. We didn't even know what to call that decade. Was it the aughts, the 2000
The
aughts,
in the 19th century, they called it the noughties.
the noughties? Yes, that's actually much better. Now we're in the 2010s. So yeah, I mean, the legislation of the Affordable Care Act was like, it was very similar to Romney Care, but to me, the politics played out really differently. And this was especially had a big, I say, negative impact on the Medicare for All movement, at least in the short term. Um, Now, at the very, very beginning, people probably might not remember this, but at the very beginning of the Affordable Care Act fight, Obama had this listening tour around the country, like big events where people would come out and talk about what health reform do they want to see. And at
Mm,
that time, the single payer movement totally was the total dominant force in health reform. We had actions outside of every single hearing event, listening tour event, and when you actually listen to people inside the room talking, everyone was overwhelmingly calling for single payer healthcare. But this did not last very long. Shortly after that, I
mm,
think in 2008, there were a few national unions, the AFL-CIO, and then some, like at the time, center-leaning progressive-y groups like Move On and CAP, the Center for American Progress, which is still kind of a
yeah.
centrist progressive group. They got this massive, massive foundation grant, and they launched Healthcare for America Now.
Each can.
HCAN, which, from I mean, we were still Healthcare Now at the time. I wasn't working there. You weren't working there. But the attempt to appropriate the name, like we're just going to stick an America in the middle of this Medicare for All group's name, was pretty, I mean, it was pretty just extraordinary. Although
It's totally shady. It's totally
oh my,
shady. Come on.
yes. The only good thing was that they were a much larger, much better funded organization. And apparently I was told that Healthcare Now got a lot of donations from people who thought they were donating to Healthcare for America Now. So suck it, HCAN. But
Direct
yeah,
benefits.
yes.
Yeah.
Well, so HCAN, they were basically formed to win a public option, which,
Mm,
fine. You go ahead, fight for the public option and the Affordable Care Act. But they were also kind of in their mission statement explicitly opposed to Medicare for All.
mm,
They said that they're fighting for, quote, a truly inclusive and accessible healthcare system in which no one is left out. Wait for it. A
mm.
choice of a private insurance plan, including keeping the insurance you have if you like it. You remember this phrase was like really big during the Affordable Care Act. Keep the insurance you
You
have if you
have.
like it. Yes.
Yeah.
Or a public insurance plan without a private insurer middleman that guarantees affordable coverage. It's like
Mm.
such bullshit. But anyway,
Don't
this
see
led to,
layers of bullshit,
oh
really,
my God.
right? Like,
Yeah.
if you like your private insurance plan, like just
Right.
starting there, like, what the fuck? Who likes?
Right.
Oh man, I really love Blue Cross, right? They really take care of me. I want to stick with them. Yeah,
Right. You
loyalty.
might like your coverage. Like if you have really good coverage, fine. You might want to keep your coverage, but no one loves their insurance company and wants to
Hmm.
keep their insurance company. But anyway, there had been a bunch of phony polling about this that led the Democratic Party for decades, probably still does actually.
Hmm.
But anyway, the fact that they explicitly like oppose Medicare for All, Healthcare for America Now, meant that there was infighting in every single state almost between like the Medicare for All wing of the progressive movement and the public option wing, and it was
That
such
shit
a
was so
clusterfuck.
tense.
Oh my
I
God!
totally remember that. That shit was
Right.
so tense. You were being told to shut up in meetings a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. There's attempts to silence the Medicare for All kind of wing of the movement, appropriation, co-opting. It was like, I think it was bad for both efforts. I think it was bad for the public
Hmm.
option effort, and it was bad for the Medicare for All movement. And so, just to put this in perspective, HCAN spent $47 million over those
Yeesh.
2 year span, most of it from this one giant foundation. And in typical DC fashion, they spent about half of that on ad purchases. Think about the grassroots organizing you could do if you spent that all on organizing.
Mm.
But they did build out a major kind of organizing infrastructure. They had staff organizers and coalitions in like every state. But you may, spoiler alert, Jillian, they did not win the public option,
Oh.
which was the entire reason for their existence.
Every time we tell this story, I hope it has a different ending. But
Yeah, right. And guess what? If they had succeeded, it probably would not have made that much of a difference either, as several states have now enacted public option laws, and actually they're not bad, but they do very little to solve the actual problems we're experiencing in the healthcare system. So
Why is that then?
well,
Why is it the public option is actually, because like I think like to most people they're like, oh,
Right.
well, it seems like a nice compromise, right?
Yeah, well, it obviously it doesn't give you universal healthcare. You still have to buy insurance. You're just buying it from a public insurer instead of a private insurer. If you can't get
Mm,
insurance through your workplace, you're still not going to be able to get it. It doesn't help solve that problem. Public insurers are like a little bit cheaper than private insurers because they have less overhead. They don't pay these huge corporate salaries. But if if you throw a public insurer into a market where they have to compete with the private insurance companies, are they going to do all the evil shit that private insurance companies do to like get clients? Are they going to charge high deductibles, high copayments, but low premiums, so everyone will buy their plan and then they can't use the healthcare that they think that they have? So it raises all those questions. And if the public insurer does all those evil things, then yes, they'll compete, but they're not going to be that much better for you than a private insurance plan. And if they don't, then they're not going to be able to compete. So anyway, and at the very best, they're just going to be a little bit cheaper. I mean, the real reason our healthcare system is so expensive is because we have all these insurance plans, public and private, mixed together. It's not primarily because they're private ones. So anyway, it was kind of I don't think it's a bad plan. You can do public option fine. It's like marginally better, but a marginal is the key there. So why spend $47 million trying to fight for that? Is
for marginal improvements,
right? Exactly. Yeah.
Oh my god. And then plus, like, I mean, just like honestly, like Democrats, worst negotiators ever, right?
Right.
Like you start from the middle. You don't start from the middle. You start from some kind of ridiculous thing that you never like expect to achieve, and then you bargain down from there. Whereas Democrats started in the middle and then bargained down from there.
They bargained down to nothing basically because they didn't win this. But also, I mean, how about starting with your values, like the thing you claim to be fighting for, which is universal health care?
Now who's being naive?
Right, exactly. But anyway, there's some takeaways from this. I thought HCAN was just totally destructive. Just their whole approach to like waging war. But the Medicare for All movement at that time, mostly what we were fighting for and organizing for was to have just the tiniest voice in the congressional debate over healthcare reform, trying to get one Medicare for All speaker added to like the hearings that Congress was conducting on healthcare reform. And basically we could not achieve that. So to me, it spoke to the grassroots capacity of the Medicare for All movement was just not enough, because we were pretty easily marginalized in Congress. We were marginalized by HCAN in the states, but we're not that small anymore, and it would be much, much harder for history to replay itself. And I don't want to say it could never replay itself, but I think it would be awfully hard for an HCAN-like entity or Congress to completely ignore Medicare for All today.
Yeah. The public option, of course, also just still it won't die.
It will not die. It will not die.
HCAN kind of sowed the seeds for the lingering public option that keeps popping up.
I'm kind of glad that some states are doing the public option now, because I think we just need to look at what it does and doesn't do instead of like it's clear that it's anything but Medicare for All proposal, right?
Yeah. Right. Anything so that we can avoid talking about actual people and their health care and yada yada yada, that bullshit. Oh yeah. Okay. So we get from there, right? We've got the ACA in place, no public option. Womp womp womp. The provisions start to kick in 2014.
Right.
27-year-olds are on their, or 26-year-olds are on their parents' insurance.
Medicaid is expanding in some states, right?
Yeah. Hello, Texas. So I mean, I feel like the next really important thing that happened was probably the 2016 presidential primaries, right? In particular, Bernard Sanders' campaign.
Hello, Bernard.
Hello, Bernard. I don't know. I mean, who knew that the Medicare for All movement, that all we really needed was like a gruff socialist octogenarian spokesman from Brooklyn to really sell it, you know?
Didn't see that coming.
Did not see that coming. And that he would be really popular with like
Mhm.
high school kids.
Yeah.
But anyway, this is like just after you actually came to healthcare now. So you're
Yeah,
now working
yeah.
in the national scene.
Mhm.
But obviously Bernie and other people who didn't have as great sound bites as
Mhm.
Bernie, right, had been calling for single payer healthcare for like a billion years.
Right.
The at least half of the billion years that Bernie's been alive. And so, I mean, it's interesting to me that like 2016, there was such a difference, right? Like, why did it hit
Yeah.
different in 2016? And why did that election cycle have such a big impact on the way that we talk about healthcare in this country?
Yeah, it was really 2016 and 2017 was when like the Medicare for All movement made a huge leap forward, or a huge leap forward, I guess I should say, in the
Huge.
old style of Bernie.
Mhm.
Um, and it kind of crossed over outside of like activisty work into just like mainstream politics. And obviously it's partly because Bernie ran a surprisingly successful campaign and almost toppled kind of the Democratic mainstream, which was even though
So
they were working.
close.
Yeah, all the Democratic institutions were kind of desperately scrambling to undermine his campaign, and he got pretty close to toppling it. But to me, I think it kind of works both ways. I think Bernie was able to run that campaign because he was running on issues that have big social movements behind them that had kind of grown up larger over the years.
Hmm.
So both Medicare for All, but also kind of environmental rights and LGBTQIA rights and anti-war messaging. I mean, if you think back to the 2008 presidential primaries with like John Edwards, Hillary
Hmm.
Clinton, and Obama, none of them supported Medicare for All or universal health care. None of them supported equal marriage. They were all kind of like tough on crime. They were all,
Oh my God. Hey,
war
Ben,
hawks, like
can I just interject? I actually canvassed in New Hampshire for John Edwards
amazing.
that season. I have never been more embarrassed,
Working class hero.
retrospectively, about a political choice.
We'll edit that part out of the podcast, and then
Thank you.
yes. I mean, he was probably the best of the three, but still, I mean, when you think about all those issues, the whole Democratic Party was kind of forced to support a lot of those issues by significant social movements, right? By Black Lives Matter, by an anti-war
Mhm.
movement, by Medicare for All movement. So they'd kind of moved the party significantly, and that to me was what enabled Bernie to kind of have this very credible primary run. And I think it was actually, I think he was literally running on these social movements, because I remember at the time, Healthcare Now doesn't endorse candidates, and most of ours, like
Mhm.
state and local chapters, also don't endorse. But having said that, I feel like probably 95% of our activists turned into like Bernie campaign, leaders on the ground when the election came around, and they had solid organizing skills from having spent years being trained in effective organizing in the Medicare for All movement. They were able to
Mhm.
use that in service of this campaign, and I think it was the same for all these other social movements. And
Yeah.
I also have this theory that this is partly why Bernie has lost 2 election cycles in a row, um, because he tends to do poorly in states, especially in the South, where there's not the same like social justice infrastructure. You can't
Mm.
just run on like social movement organizations, like all those activists turning out for you.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. That's for sure. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
like states like South Carolina, where maybe more traditional institutions like churches are far more important.
Even
So
if you look at like unions, right? The union density in the
right,
South
yep,
is so
yep,
low, right? So there are all these progressive unions that were
right.
supporting Bernie, but they're just not strong here in the South. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So I think there was this kind of weird symbiosis between these growing social movements and kind of this incumbent challenge by the Bernie wing of the party. And then, of course, he lost the primary. Clinton became the nominee.
Mm.
Clinton loses in just like a terrifying election where Republicans sweep the House, the Senate, and Trump comes into office.
That was a tough one.
Oh God, that was quite a
Do
moment
you
for everyone.
do you remember where you were that election night?
Oh, I do not. I should. That should be one of those moments where
Yeah,
I
how
think
can you not remember?
I feel like I've just blacked it out the whole episode.
I'll tell
I
you,
mean,
I was at the the Democratic Party
mhm.
Massachusetts. They have that big party every
Oh
election
no.
day at
Mhm.
the Fairmont Copley, which is a very fancy
Right.
hotel
Oh.
in Boston. And I went there because I had been working on a campaign that was invited. I wasn't personally invited
Mhm,
because
mhm.
you know Democrats don't like me that much. So regardless, so we went there, and just as Trump won, there was one of our friends who was from Chile there, and just as Trump won, he was like, "Now you guys will get to see what it's like to live with a dictator."
Right. Oh God. Oh Lord.
Good
Yeah,
times.
that was a rough one. I think I stayed at home for that election because I remember I went to bed early. I was like, I'm not going to stay up and watch this. And then so I had crushing news in the morning. But and I
Yeah.
remember Clinton had planned this massive celebration thing
Mhm.
with a glass ceiling at a huge convention center that was going to shatter with
Mm.
stuff. And then when she lost, they moved to like this small ballroom at the New Yorker Hotel in New York. And we ended up having our conference about a month later in the same ballroom at the New
Oh,
Yorker. I was like, oh God.
that's
Uh,
unfortunate. That's like where good ideas go to die.
yeah, there was some weird symbiosis going on there.
Mm.
But I think the fact that Clinton lost that election also kind of, you know, it was a cautionary tale about running against universal health care and just kind of the Clinton approach to taking on a right wing populist, you know?
Hell yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I think that also built up some kind of momentum about around Medicare for all. And just, you know, the fact that Medicare for all was like the number one issue, probably in that primary debate. It was like the one biggest thing I think separating Clinton from Bernie as candidates. And nothing in the United States gets press attention like a presidential election. So it
Mm-mm.
really pushed Medicare for all into the mainstream for the first time ever.
Yeah, it was a nice moment.
Big change for us. Yeah.
I mean, so as you point out, though, right? Like a lot of that was coming on the backs of all of these different social
Right.
movements that were growing at the time, right?
Right.
And one of the reasons they were growing was because of a lot of anger, right? That was
Mhm.
fueled by Trump. And the Medicare for All movement wasn't, any exception, right? One of the things that got people really interested in Medicare for All and healthcare reform generally, right, was the backlash after the Affordable Care Act,
Yeah.
the rise of Trumpism, repeal and replace, etc.
Mhm. Right.
So, what would you say about how that the red tide affected our movement?
Yeah, I do think that Bernie run kind of put Medicare for all in the mainstream, but I think the Republican attempt over like a whole year to try and repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act actually did more to grow the Medicare for all movement at the
Hmm.
grassroots level than any of the presidential campaigns. Um, so uh, and this is just to set the stage. When I was hired in 2013 at Healthcare Now, the Medicare for All bill in the House that year had 37 original co-sponsors when it was first filed, and by the end of the session, we had managed to get 63 co-sponsors on the bill. This is in the House. I feel
Mm.
like we might not have even had a Senate bill at the time. Um, but then in 2007, this is kind of by the time repeal and replace came around, the number of co-sponsors of the Medicare for All bill in the House surged to 120 in the House,
Mm.
almost double that from just a few years ago. And Bernie, for the first time, introduced kind of a new Medicare for All bill in the Senate with 16 co-sponsors, which is a really significant achievement at the time. So that's just to show you kind of the outcomes of what had happened. But
Hmm.
the way
Hmm.
that we got there was obviously, there was just desperation and terror and fear about repealing the Affordable Care Act. What could happen when the already kind of shitty access to healthcare we have now would be taken away from millions of people.
Yeah.
So there was, as you probably remember, there was like town halls being held all over the place. Especially Democrats were holding town halls.
Yep.
Republicans were a little afraid to. Um, but at those town halls, people were coming. I was kind of worried actually that it would people would come out and say, we need to keep the healthcare we have, but no one came out and said that. They said, we really need a universal healthcare system. We need Medicare for all. And we would just get hundreds of videos of people like shouting down their legislators at town halls, calling for Medicare for all. And we had no idea who they were or where they came from. They weren't part of any like organization that belongs to the Medicare for all. It was like a real social movement moment where
like
organizing
real ordinary people.
Yeah, organizing for Medicare for all was just kind of spilling out into the general populace. People were taking to the streets. People were like shouting down their legislators, demanding Medicare for all, and they had nothing to do with like a formal organized campaign, you know. So that is really what started kicking Democrats in the pants and pushing them into the Medicare for all camp. And yeah, I think it just it was one of these big reasons that we saw a surge in capacity and interest and support for the issue. So
yeah.
And then of course it helped that repeal and replace completely failed. People might remember John McCain walking up and sticking his thumb down, but there was like 7 other Republicans behind him who were afraid to vote yes, and he just kind of took the bullet for the party. And a lot of that was from just the massive resistance that rose to that effort to repeal and replace. And it didn't hurt that the hospitals were also opposed to the repeal and replace. So there was some corporate opposition as well. But
this reminds me a little bit about what's going on right now with Republicans trying to really eliminate Medicare and Medicaid as we know it. And, you know, as soon as Biden called them out on it, they were like, no, wait, we've never said that. No.
Right.
Because once you've given people something, they really hate having it taken away.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And this is why Medicare is like, you know, Republicans will try to privatize Medicare, but they will not try to take away the entire entitlement program. I mean, there would just be a revolution in the streets. Same thing with Social Security. So it's hard. It's easier to hang on to, but I mean, not easy, but easier.
Easier.
Yes.
And honestly, that's really all we're looking for. Just slightly easier.
Yep.
But so we've talked a lot about policy fights and politicians, right? But I think like the most inspiring part of that is what you were saying about, you know, this kind of grassroots uprising for Medicare for all. Yeah. So what else like kind of sticks out to you about the way that the movement has grown since 2016?
Yeah, I mean, as you remember, that first Trump year when it really looked like shit was going to hit the fan, and it did to some extent. We saw just a massive growth of grassroots organizing kind of across the board. I think, you know, the women's rights organizing became like had you know, massive presence, turning out millions and millions of people all across the country. And we also saw the same thing. There was a bunch of new kind of multi-issue organizations that started growing. Obviously, Our Revolution kind of came immediately out of the Bernie campaign. That was like the Bernie database. So they were a big multi-issue organization that started doing grassroots organizing around the country, including Medicare for all work. Democratic Socialists of America, which we have known and loved for many, many years, but they were really before Bernie's run in 2016, they were a pretty small group, at least in my corner of the world in Massachusetts. It was kind of like New Left people from the 60s.
Oh yeah, no, that's for real. That's for real.
Right.
One time I did this, like, I did this talk at one of the DSA meetings in Boston back in like maybe 2010, 2011. And like 2 people showed up, and the guy who organized it wrote me a thank you note afterward. And he was like, thank you. And I apologize for the moribund nature of the Medicare for all movement in Massachusetts.
Oh, that's quite a word.
Yeah. Moribund means dying.
Yes.
But it came back from the dead, which is awesome.
Exactly. DSA saw this massive surge in membership, especially among young people who were kind of Bernie adjacent.
Shout out to all my comrades in DSA, because that didn't happen without organizing either.
Yeah. And the other extraordinary thing to me that happened after around that time, 2017, is that there was a lot of organizations who were just kind of like defend the ACA organizations, who kind of started moving into the Medicare for all camp and started doing Medicare for all organizing in addition to like, let's defend the ACA, which again, you know, you might think that they would go in the opposite direction during that particular year. But we saw, and these are like big national networks of grassroots organizations like People's Action, Center for Popular Democracy, even a little bit Move On-ish. And And I think their members were really just calling for Medicare for all, wanted to be doing Medicare for all work. And today those groups are firmly Medicare for all advocacy organizations. So we saw just a huge growth of the movement, of organizing capacity. We saw a bunch of unions kind of really re-engage with the Medicare for all work. And to me, it was mostly multi-issue organizations kind of stepping into the more Medicare for all movement in a bigger way, committing resources, committing activists, time. So just our capacity to organize went through the roof starting in 2016, 2017, just totally incomparable to when I was first hired, or back in my mass care days in 2006. We were just working with so fewer people, and we were all in these like single issue Medicare for all organizations for the most part.
Right.
Yeah.
Siloed, right?
Yep. Yep.
Different
world.
Intersectionality, it's where it's at. So our, for our regular listeners, that our one of our interns does these the show notes for us and does a little show outline for us. So,
great.
Yeah, shout out to Pim, who is awesome. But Pim is clearly also not yet jaded. Because
I love it.
This is the question Pim came up for you. The fight has been long and hard, but we shouldn't forget about all the good that came out of it.
Yeah, we just talked about all the good that came out of it. I agree,
No,
Pim.
it's true. It's good. It's good. I just don't think either one of us would have come up with such a hopeful framing.
Yeah, probably not.
But it's totally true, right? Like doctors groups now openly support Medicare for all. We get young people constantly reaching out to us to get involved. So, there's a lot of good shit going on. And what's giving you hope these days, Ben?
Yeah, it's a good question, because especially like right now, it feels like a quiet kind of moment for not just Medicare for all, but like healthcare reform in general. It's like a split Congress. We just like went through a pandemic. There was like the really depressing experience of the Build Back Better bill last year. So I think it's, for a fight like Medicare for all, where the opposition is really strong, it can feel like, it could be a long-term struggle, but you don't know how long. These social movements, we feel like we're probably Medicare for all is going to be on the scale of like civil rights, women's suffrage. Like it could be a multi-generational fight to win it, but you don't know how many generations. It is easy to kind of lose hope. But when you look back on how far we've come just in the last 5 or 6 years, I think it really is impressive. And to me, one lesson is that, when it's hard for us as a movement to like control when healthcare is in the mainstream at all. But when healthcare is pushed into the mainstream, Medicare for all usually takes like a leap forward in our organizing work. Like whenever there's a big political opportunity, I do feel like, we start seeing irrevocable progress in the movement. And it doesn't happen automatically. You have to do all the organizing and things. You have to do all the outreach. You have to do all the base building. But I do feel like we are in a great position to take advantage of that next one. And people just can't forget that it is important to do a different type of organizing during these quiet moments. You do have to do kind of the continuous outreach and base building and talking to people when it's not in the press. Otherwise, you're not going to be in a position to take a leap forward when the next opportunity comes around. And I do think that probably our next leap forward as a movement is going to look a little different from the last one. I feel like the last, that 2016, 2017 moment, we saw like a lot of like left organizing, like very progressive left-based organizations. But when you look at the geography of like, where on the map do we need to do organizing to kind of get the next group of Democratic co-sponsors on board the bill? It's not in sort of urban, very progressive parts of the country anymore. We're starting to look more at like the exurban, suburban, rural districts. So I think that where the movement has to go next is going to be a little bit different. It's not going to be on the backs necessarily of all left organizations. I think we need to start building some like new coalitions. But I think honestly, that's exciting, because I don't like talking, even though I'm a leftist, all my policies are left. I don't like talking like an activist. I prefer to talk about this issue as like a human being, just in human terms.
Okay.
It's like, I don't know, activist speak really kind of annoys me.
Mhm.
And I think that I think, to be honest, that's how you win social movements. Like, you don't win social movements with like ultra political language or ideology. You win social movements by appealing to people's like really basic human values,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, and
Morality.
exactly. And I do think this issue touches on just like really basic human values that almost everyone shares, even kind of people on the right, even if they will absolutely refuse to support Medicare for all because of the politics in Congress right now.
Yeah.
But
And folks like that kind of like what at the heart of it, that idea that life is precious and that our
mhm,
lives are sort of fragile, and that
mhm.
we all have to work together to create that kind of a safety net. That seems to have really kind of come. That idea seems to have come to prominence in public discourse since the pandemic as well.
Yeah, and we've all got, so many of us have this like weird shared trauma from the healthcare system,
Yeah.
that, and we know that, I mean, the Republican Party right now basically doesn't have a healthcare plan. The kind of centrist Democrat, they don't really have a health plan either, except for a public option. They claim to support universal healthcare, but they don't have like a here's how we're going to get to universal healthcare plan. So to me,
Mhm.
there's not much on the map. We're not like really fighting an alternative. We're really just fighting money, organized money from the healthcare industry. So
Looking forward to that.
yes, oh, it's my favorite activity. So
Fighting with rich people.
yes.
Oh, yeah, that's good stuff. That's good stuff. So, I mean, really, this has actually ended up being a much more positive episode. I feel like I say that at every episode. You put me in a really good mood, Ben. I'm just going to
Good.
say
All
that,
right. All right. Yeah.
So it does seem like we've come far.
Yeah, and I mean, we have the privilege of having a job, Jillian, where we really want to put ourselves out of work. So
Yes.
I don't want to celebrate being in this in this job for 10 years or 17 years, and I'm not going to say I'm looking forward to the next 10 years, because I hope we don't get
Hell
to
no.
the next 10 years. But Jillian, here's to putting ourselves out of work as promptly as we possibly can.
Salud.
All right, shall
Excellent. Well,
we?
thank you. Well, yeah, we
Yeah.
should definitely wrap up. But I first would like to thank you for being such an excellent and distinguished guest on the
Oh,
podcast.
and you did a wonderful job solo hosting.
Yeah, okay. Now you do the wrap up stuff because I don't feel like it.
Okay. All right. Well, I will thank our podcast team, the most important thing we do at the end of these podcasts. Our podcast manager, Angelique Davis, thank you so much. Our researcher for this episode was Pim Rajanaporn, and our show notes writer was Jerry Katz, and our audio editor was Christian Brandt.
Ooh, one last thing. I see now that that our friend Jill Parkinson is actually
Yes.
commenting on YouTube about this. I just want to say Jill Parkinson is a viral TikTok star at this
Oh.
point, and she's going to be joining us for our next podcast, which is very
Oh,
exciting.
that's exciting.
So that's a little foreshadowing for next time.
Excellent. So last thing, I will release you all in good behavior, but don't forget to like this episode, subscribe to the Medicare for All podcast on your favorite podcast platform. And this podcast is a project of the Healthcare Now Education Fund. So if you want to support our work, of course, you can donate at our website, healthcare-now.org. Until next time, everyone.
Stay safe and stay dangerous.